Um, we are going to engage on a topic that has been around with us for a very long time. It's actually been with us for over 3,300 years from the time that the Jews were at Sinai receiving the Torah. In fact, the Talmud makes a fascinating statement that the word Sinai, if it's spelled with a sin, means hate. That when the Torah was given to the Jewish people, that's when anti-Semitism started in full force. And even though anti-Semitism is poisonous, it's mind-boggling, it causes us a tremendous amount of grief and suffering, but we have to learn about it, know how to tackle it, and how to live a normal life. As long as Judaism has been around, anti-Semitism has been around, as well as anti-Semitic jokes. There's the famous story that when the Tsar Alexander was assassinated in 1881 in Russia, one of the rabbis was meeting with one of the Russian officers, and he said, well, guess who's going to be blamed now? The Jews and the milkman. So the officer said, why the milkman? So he answered, why the Jews? So those are the kind of stories that always proliferated throughout our history. But anti-Semitism goes very deep. And unfortunately, there are those that think that it can be cured. There are those, on the other hand, that think that maybe Jews are to blame for a little bit of the anti-Semitism. And thirdly, people have different attitudes at how to deal with it. We're going to divide this topic into 4 different sessions. The first session is going to be analyzing the data of anti-Semitism and our reaction to it and how to deal with it. The second session is going to deal with the guilt feeling that some Jewish people have, and why we don't need to apologize for being Jewish. And we're going to examine a whole bunch of texts in regards to that. And in the third session, we're going to be talking about Israel and how Israel today has become the target of anti-Semitism and how we deal with that, and talk about the Jewish values that are connected to Israel. And in the fourth class, which is going to be the idea of change of heart, what do we expect with all of our educational activities that we do and all of the programs that we do to battle anti-Semitism? Realistically, what do we think we can accomplish with that, both for ourselves and for the community at large? So the point of going through these statistics is not necessarily to present a fact one way or another, but just to talk about it in general terms, just to give us an idea. So number one, I have to say that growing up in the 60s and in the 70s, and even in the 80s, as a child of the 50s, we knew, here in the United States, we knew about anti-Semitism. Most of us grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust and knew a lot of the Holocaust survivors and heard the horror stories of what they endured in Eastern Europe, where anti-Semitism was actually promoted by the local authorities, by the governments, by the society. And similarly, for those that came from communist countries, how communism tried to wipe out any vestige of Jewish practice and also had blatant anti-Semitism. Yes?
Sorry, someone was trying to join.
Okay, that's always, you can always interrupt me for that, because I'm looking at the people, not at the screen. So we felt that we were in relative safety here in the United States. And of course, there were incidents of anti-Semitism here or there, but it wasn't something that we had to deal with. I would say that in the last 10 to 20 years, things have changed. There has been a rise of anti-Semitic incidents. And I would say this, that there were studies that were done, especially in the UK, and In the UK, when they interviewed a lot of the Jewish people, if you open up your book to page 3 and you look at figure 1.1, you will find that when Jewish people were asked, in the past 2 years, would have you considered leaving Britain due to anti-Semitism? And you look at the statistics of 2019, it's a higher number than ever before. Similarly, Jews in the UK were asked that due to anti-Semitism, they don't want to show any visible signs of Judaism and go out like with a kippah or a Star of David. And again, there are many that are trying to hide their Judaism. But what I want to say is this: to have an honest view of where anti-Semitism is today, we have to look at the difference between incidents to attitudes. There's no question, as you will see on this graph on the PowerPoint, that there has been a significant rise from 2013 till 2017, a slight drop in 2018, and then a rise again in 2019 of anti-Semitic incidents. Some of the incidents are very familiar to us. When the event happened on a Shabbat morning in Pittsburgh, that an anti-Semite walked in armed into the Tree of Life synagogue and gunned down 11 Jews to death, wounded others, which was considered to be the greatest massacre on American soil. And then a few months later in California at Chabad of Poway, on the last day of Passover, a gunman walked in and shot people. 1 person was killed, 3 were injured. So therefore, it definitely brings it to home. However, I would say that if you look at attitudes have actually changed. And so this is a concerning rise. I'll just have to go to the next one. Attitudes have actually changed because they've done, here's where I want to show you. By the way, the figures here are all about all kinds of events. There are figures that show that when they do a Pew study in the United States of people's attitudes towards Jews, it has changed dramatically, even from the 60s. People were more comfortable saying anti-Semitic statements then, or really having a negative view about Jewish people, and that has changed. What is the course mission? What are we trying to do here? Let me set it up there. What we're trying to do here is to have an honest look of the attitudes that we have towards Judaism and towards anti-Semitism. So here I want to throw something out to you. If you give a look on page 8, this is a study that was done in 2010-20 by Jewish American for asking Jewish Americans a question. And that was, what do you think is the most important issue in Judaism to you? I want you to open up your books and please look at it because this is very important. Page number 8. What you will see is that 76% of American Jews believe that remembering the Holocaust is the most important part of Judaism. That's why you have a lot of Holocaust education. You have a lot of children in Judaism that are raised on the concepts of the Holocaust. The next, which comes close to it, is leading an ethical and moral life. Then comes working for justice and equality. Give a look what comes last as far as what's important to Jews in America. 15% said observing Jewish law, which means to say that the culture of Judaism today in the 21st century is that Judaism is defined by anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic studies. And that is very sad. It's very sad because we should not be defined by external forces. It's very sad because it gives a negative connotation to Jewish life when Jewish life has to be celebrated and Jewish life is full of joy. And we're going to see some text. The first text, text 1a, is written by a very famous professor in Georgia. Her name is Deborah Lipstadt. There was a movie made about her because she actually challenged one of the British Holocaust deniers, and there was a very big trial in England about that, and there was a movie made about it, and I think it's, I recommend that film, that people should watch it. She's very outspoken, and she studies anti-Semitism. She teaches Holocaust studies. Yet give a look what she writes in text 1a, which is on page 9. Most Jews will immediately step forward when Jews anywhere are being attacked by anti-Semites. This is, of course, as it should be. What is regrettable, however, is that for some Jews, the fight against anti-Semitism becomes the sum total of their Jewish identity. Recently, a much respected Jewish communal leader lamented to me, that's to Deborah, that he regretted not having educated his children about Jewish traditions and culture. He was, however, very proud of the fact that he embedded within them a total intolerance of anti-Semitism. His kids were prepared to be at the barricades to do battle against this hatred, and many others as well. His comments made me sad. Anti-Semitism has become the drummer to which his family's Jewish identity marches. They know of Jew as an object, not subject. In other words, what is done to Jews becomes far more significant than what Jews do. This well-intentioned Jewish father has deprived his children of a rich and multifaceted legacy. They have been taught to see themselves mainly as perennial victims. This cedes to the oppressor control of one's destiny. It leaves many Jews, including this man's children, aware of what to be against, but not what to be for. This is an amazing statement from someone who champions the fight against anti-Semitism. So what does she say? People are more interested in what is done to Jews than what Jews do. There was a speaker that came to Charlotte 35 years ago, and he banged at the podium at Shalom Park, and he said, we have done so much caring about Jews, but we have done very little caring about Judaism. And what happens is that even though anti-Semitism is very important to us, and that's obviously why we have this course, but we can't forget that it's not all about the negative thing. Not long ago, there was a very well-attended demonstration in New York City, which was pro-Israel, and it was also standing up against anti-Semitism. And the speaker there was the former New York Times columnist, Barry Weiss. And what did she say? The Jewish people were not put on earth to be anti-Semites. We were put on earth to be Jews. So I want to set the record straight that even though we are going to tackle anti-Semitism, and we're going to look for ways how to outsmart it and how to overcome it and how to subdue it, but nevertheless, it's not our obsession. Our obsession is how to live as a Jew and what does Judaism mean to us. So if you open up the book to page 11, we're going to look at some of the questions that are driving this course. This is figure 1.7. Number one, what are some tools for coping with fears triggered by anti-Semitism, which means there are people that are living a frightened life. And we're not talking about Holocaust survivors, because very few are around, but we're talking about the third, fourth generation that they don't know how to cope. What role does faith play in addressing anti-Semitism? What are the best strategies to reduce anti-Semitism? What are the root causes of anti-Semitism? How does identifying these factors impact our efforts to prevent the hatred? That will actually be in lesson 2 next week. How can we counter Israel-focused anti-Semitism? And how can we determine when criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic? This particular topic is very, very important, because it's true with a lot of the young people, especially those that attend colleges and universities, where there's rampant anti-Israel feelings. Many of the Jewish kids are actually hiding their Jewish identity. They're putting away their kippot, they're putting away their Star of David. Others are just the opposite. How do we deal with that? And number 6, how can we restore well-meaning Jewish youth from unwittingly lending their voices to anti-Semitic agendas? So some Jewish kids hide from anti-Semitism. Others join the enemy because they think that if they're going to speak the voice of the anti-Semite, they're condemning the so-called atrocities of Israel. They're condemning the hatred that Israel is showing towards their neighbors. And that's more than just being passive and silent. They're actually joining the enemy. And 7, what is the best strategy for dealing with a public figure who takes on an unfavorable position towards us? Some of it we will talk about. Some of it we will talk about tonight, and some of it will be spread over the rest of the class. So what we want to address first is the fear factor, because that is quite important. And the fear factor is this is following. I want to know, and this is true with people that are listening and watching on Zoom. We don't need to see a show of hands, but I want you to think about it. How many of you have actually experienced an anti-Semitic assault or an anti-Semitic incident? That could be from someone calling you a name. That could be from someone writing you a hate letter. That can be from someone even saying something against Israel, or worse, physical violence. I can say growing up in New York, I had that experience more than once. Actually, in Carolina, I never had it, although I did see one time somebody with a swastika, but he probably never saw a Orthodox Jew, so he didn't know who I was. And I met him in Durham, North Carolina, and but I was never frightened of them. Actually, in North Carolina, the state of North Carolina was very involved in battling the anti-Semites. And I can only tell you one thing, that they had people that infiltrated all the groups to basically collect data and to neutralize what they were doing. But that's just on another point, which we're going to tackle in a minute. So when somebody experiences an anti-Semitic act, what happens immediately is that they start to worry. Some of them are incapable of a response. Others view everybody as a potential threat to them. And that becomes problematic. So we want to deal with the feelings first, and then we're going to go into some of the philosophy. Are you all ready? No distractions? Okay. Because distractions distract me. That's why I'm very affected by everybody in the room and everybody listening, because you're all in my room. So here is something which is very interesting. The Talmud quotes a Jewish scholar who actually never made it into the Bible, but he was canonized by the non-Jews, and his name was Ben Sira, and he wrote a lot of words of wisdom, and some of them are quoted by the Talmud. And this is in text 2 on page 13. It is stated in the book of Ben Sira, do not allow anxiety into your heart, for as anxiety has killed the mighty. What does it mean? You can have someone that's very strong, exudes confidence, and everything goes well until they're hit with anxiety. And anxiety means that it goes to the core of their existence. It goes to the core of their essence. They cannot deal with it. They eat it, they sleep it, they're worried, and then they collapse. They cannot deal with it. So what are you supposed to do with it? So the next quote that the Gemara says, there's a quote from Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, which is in Proverbs, and he says, if there is anxiety in your heart, quash it. What does it mean, quash it? Get rid of it. Don't allow the anxiety to take over. Now, again, our goal here is not to belittle anti-Semitism and make nothing out of it. Our goal is first to learn how to deal with it. And the fact to deal with it is that we have to have courage, we have to have strength, and we cannot have anxiety, because if we have anxiety, then we already give control to the enemy, and we lost it. So when Jews today are worried and they're constantly scared and their children are worried and they don't know if the next anti-Semite is going to come and do something against them, they have to stop it. But on the other hand, we have to be proactive. And this brings us to a few of the interesting facts here. First of all, there is this concept of the miraculous people. I want you to look at the PowerPoint that you have in front of you on the screen, and those of you on Zoom will see it. On the left side of the screen, you see a Hanukkah menorah in the windowsill. This is actually a true picture. It's not a staged picture. This was taken by a rabbi's daughter in Germany when the Nazis established a headquarters right across the street of their house. And they had a menorah in the window for Hanukkah. What was in the background? A Nazi flag. This picture actually is taken from a postcard. And in the back of the picture, which is like a postcard, it's not a postcard, but they made it into a postcard, they write that the light of Judaism would outshine the darkness of Nazism. And that was a prophetic vision, because the darkness of Nazism was very dark, and it succeeded, unfortunately, in wiping out a third of the Jewish population. But nevertheless, Judaism survived. That concept of miraculous survival is something which is very important to us. I want you to read again what Deborah Lipstadt writes. And again, this is the scholar on anti-Semitism. So she writes in text 3 on page 14, the fact that we're here is such a historical anomaly. It makes no sense. So sometimes when I'm asked about anti-Semitism, people will say, well, how can you be optimistic in all this? How can you see the positive? It's such a dreary situation. And I say, because we shouldn't be here. And the fact that we are here shouldn't be taken for granted. So for that reason, you need to consider the full picture. In the back of this lesson, there's a collage of positive and negative. The collage of positive is with the survival of the miracle of Jewish survival. We're going to read one of them soon. But everybody knows what Mark Twain said. He writes, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Persians rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and the Roman followed and made vast noise, and they are gone. Other peoples have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it burnt out, and they sit in twilight now, or have vanished. The Jews saw them all, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert and aggressive mind. All things are mortal but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality? There are many of these kind of statements that were written, and there's a lot to read. There's also statements of anti-Semitism. We'll get to that in a minute. So I want to tell you a little bit of a story here in history that is very interesting, and it has to do with Maimonides. Yemen is in the news today a lot, but Yemen had a very strong Jewish community. In fact, in Israel and abroad, there's a very healthy Jewish community called the Yemenite Jewish community. They're called Teimanim. We even have some of the Yemenite Jews that are here in Charlotte that are part of our congregation. The Yemenites went through a very difficult time in 1168 through 1168 and 1173. What was the problem? Problem number one was that a fanatical Muslim cleric became the ruler of Yemen and decreed that all the Jews in Yemen should need to convert to Islam, and if not, they will be punished or put to terrible suffering. That was problem number one. Number two, there was one Jew that actually, who was prominent, and he converted to Islam. He became an apostate, and he began to persuade the Jews to say to the Jews, this is the true truth, and you have to come to Islam and go away from Judaism. To make matters worse, there was another individual that declared himself to be the Jewish Messiah. And the entire community in Yemen was in tremendous turmoil. The great rabbi of Yemen tried as much as he can to keep the Jews in line and to encourage them, but he was out of resources. And what he did was he wrote a letter to Maimonides. And Maimonides wrote him back a letter. The letter actually has been retrieved in its full handwriting. And you have to realize that Maimonides wrote in Hebrew, but he also wrote in what's called Jewish Arabic, just like we have today, Yiddish, which is written with Hebrew letters. You have Ladino, which is a kind of Spanish, which is written with Hebrew letters. In those days, the Jews spoke a certain kind of Arabic that was also written with Hebrew letters. And the beginning of the letter is in pure Hebrew, but then the rest of the letter is in this, what they call Yiddish Arabic. And it was translated by his grandson. And then they got the copy, they got the original and they copied it, and it's been printed. And here is one of the things that Maimonides wrote. Maimonides wrote them a very, very, very long letter. And in the letter, he actually addressed all three issues about the truth of the faith of Judaism, and also how not to worry about the apostate. And he also gave the definition of what the signs are of the true Messiah, and not to believe anyone that says that they're the Messiah. But the underlying or overarching issue that was bothering the Jews at that time was their insecurity, because here the government had now said, either you convert or you're dead or you're gone. This is even before the Spanish expulsion. And they felt that it was all lost. So the Rambam writes the following, text 4, on page 15. God assured our father Jacob early on that although the nations would enslave his descendants, treat them cruelly and subjugate them, his children would survive and endure, whereas those who enslave them will eventually disappear. This is very similar to what I read before from Mark Twain. The difference is that Mark Twain wrote that hundreds of years later. This was written in 1173. God told him in Genesis, your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. Now, usually when we say like the dust of the earth, what comes into our mind? Usually we think about the amount of people, just like you can't count the granulars of the earth. That's how plentiful the Jews will be. That's how many Jews you will have. The Rambam comes here and says there's a deeper interpretation as well. And that is that dust can never be destroyed. Granules of sand can never be destroyed. They can be trampled on, but they can never be destroyed. They can never be burnt. They always remain. So he says, although they are destined to be trampled and downtrodden, as everyone tramples the dust of the earth, they will overcome and triumph in the end. Just as, to continue the analogy, the dust eventually rises over those who trample upon it when their corpses are buried. So when a person is buried, the very sand that they stepped on and walked on is now on top of them. And so Israel will remain in existence, whereas those that have trodden upon her will not. I want to stop here for a second. If you look at all the countries that persecuted the Jews, all the regimes that persecuted the Jews in a massive way, none of them are there today, or at least most of them are not there. Whether it was Greece or Rome or later it was some of the Christian countries or the Muslim countries, or Spain for that matter, they all became very, very weak. They had no lasting power, and they could not understand how, after all of the oppression, the Jew is still alive, the Jew is still there. And not only that, the Jew is still there with the same faith in Judaism. Then Maimonides continues, and he says, the Creator similarly assured us through his prophets that we will never be destroyed, that he will never permit our annihilation, and that we will never stray from being a nation devoted to his purpose. Just as it is, this is a very important point, because this actually is addressing our days. When we're worried that we're losing so many of our youth to Judaism, and they're turning away from authentic Judaism or the ideals of Judaism, that it's whittling down, what will be left? You know, the prognosticators are saying that Judaism in another 50 years will be minute. Maimonides says it'll never happen. And he gives an example and a proof to that. And he says, just as it is impossible for God's own existence to be nullified, so is it impossible that we should be destroyed and eliminated from the world. So spoke Malachi, the prophet, I am God and I have not changed, and you, the children of Jacob, have not been destroyed. So what is the meaning of that? This is a very, very powerful statement, because it's basically saying that the eternity of the Jews is based on the eternity of God. And for that reason, the miracle of Jewish survival has baffled historians, sociologists, and we know that the roots are there from this blessing that God gave to the Jewish people, starting with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. Even when Yaakov, which we're going to be reading this in the Torah in another few weeks, and actually we have a whole part of that course in the next lesson, where it says that it's a halacha, that it's a way of life, that Esau, who was the son of Isaac, but he's the father of Rome, will always hate Jacob until the coming of Mashiach. But God promised Jacob that he and his seed will never be destroyed. Now, it doesn't mean that we can actually take it easy, as we're going to get to in a minute. Because I want to take it to the next one. Because there is something that we're doing about it, and that's the education. And here is something which is very interesting. Today, when we look at anti-Semitism, we say that anti-Semitism is actually part of certain individual or certain groups. But if you ask anyone in the United States, do you believe that the government of the United States is anti-Semitic? I don't think anyone will say that the government is anti-Semitic. Does the government have policies of anti-Semitism? Absolutely not. Would anyone ever be able to get up in the United States Congress and say, I am an anti-Semite? No. There are anti-Semites in the Congress. There's no question about it. There are anti-Semites everywhere. But to say that it's institutionalized, that is not true. And we don't believe that it's going to happen because the country is not going to tolerate it. And I just want you to know another thing from my personal experience, which I want to share with everybody. Contrary to what people believe, that in rural America, there's a lot of anti-Semitism, in my 46 or 47 years of traveling through the rural areas of the Carolinas, the mountains and the East, and even going up to Virginia and West Virginia, I have never encountered anti-Semitism in the rural areas. I have actually seen Israeli flags hanging in the most remote places, or a sign saying, we stand with Israel. It's just remarkable. And one time I was in West Virginia staying overnight in a motel, and I was working in the business center, which was open in the lobby, and somebody came over and said, oh, there's the Jew. And the person behind the desk was horrified and stopped the individual and came back to tell me they're not locals, they're from Ohio. We are not like that. We adore the Jews. So the point of the matter is, you never know. A lot of times it looks that way, but it's not necessarily so. But the point that we're going to make here is that attitudes in the United States have actually changed. And I was trying to bring up this graphic before, but I have it here. On the one hand, there's no question that there's been a rise of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States. And actually in a lot of the big cities, even in the neighborhood that I grew up in Brooklyn, there's a lot of anti-Semitism there now. Or I should say anti-Semitic incidents. However, we have to see that there's two truths. And the other truth is attitudes of anti-Semitism is in decline. As an example, if you give a look at figure 8, these are questions that the ADL put out to non-Jews, asking them these questions. And you'll see the answers that they got in 1964 compared to the answers that they got in 2019 and the years in between. So if you look at the student page 18, one question was, Jews stick together more than other Americans. Jews always like to be the head of things. Jews are more loyal to Israel than to America. Jews have too much power in the business world. Jews have too much control and influence on Wall Street. Jews are just as honest as other business people, probably false, they would say. Jews don't care what happened to anyone but their own kind. Jews have too much power in the United States today. Jewish businessmen are so shrewd that other people do not have a fair chance at competition. These are the usual tropes that you hear against Jews. Jews are more willing than others to use shady practices to get what they want. Jews have a lot of irritating faults. Now, remember when these questions were asked, it was asked to be answered anonymously. In other words, people's names were not taken down. These were just anonymous responses. And if you look in 1964, almost 30% of American non-Jews believe that. But in 2019, it's just above 10% that said that. So there was a decline from close to 30% to 10%. So what we're finding is that in the groups that are anti-Semitic, they have become much bolder in doing their anti-Semitic acts, either because they are afraid, they're not afraid anymore, either because they feel that there are going to be no more repercussions, either it is because crime in general is on the increase. We don't know exactly what the reason behind it is, but to say that it's a widespread attitude in the country is wrong. And actually the ADL itself put it out. If you look at page 20 in text 5, it is heartening that attitudes towards Jews have improved over the last few years and historically have declined significantly in America, said Abraham H. Foxman, the ADL National Director. On the occasion of our centennial, it causes us to take a broader perspective to appreciate how far we have come in 100 years. In 1913, there were no surveys like this, but anti-Semitism was rife in public and private expressions in universities, jobs, and neighborhoods. In 1964, when we did our first survey, we found that 29% of Americans held anti-Semitic views. So we in America have made real progress. So we're dealing with two truths, and we have to deal with both of these two truths. Now, believe me, even if it's a small percentage of anti-Semites and they decide to do nasty things, it still could be very worrisome. And we don't just say, it's just 10%, let's dismiss them. That's not our attitude. But to say that the sky is falling and that the whole country is turning to be anti-Semitic, that's far from the truth. So how do we deal with this issue? How do we deal with this issue of the anti-Semitism? So the first thing that we have to deal with is our own integrity, our own self. And I don't blame a Holocaust survivor coming to this country and hearing some trashy kids screaming Heil Hitler that they think that it's happening all over again. But I would say that many of us feel very uncomfortable with it. And there has to be an inner strength. And that's where faith plays a role. And we're going to have a few minutes talking about faith, how it's internalized. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. In your knowledge of the Torah, what do you think is the most often repeated two-word phrase in the entire Tanakh? And anyone that wants to answer can unmute themselves and tell me what the answer is. Anyone want to take a stab at it? Now, if you say, and God spoke to Moses, okay, but that's not a directive. What are the most common two words?
Fear not.
Fear not, because you looked ahead. You had your cheat sheet. Al tira, do not fear. Sometimes it says al tiru in the plural. So it appears 44 times in the individual and the singular, 70 times with the plural, that's 110 times. Now, why would God say, do not fear? Why would he send the prophets to say, do not fear? Not only that, in our synagogue, after Olenu, after the Kaddish is recited, we have a song that we sing, and it starts with the words, Al tira mipahat pita mishoat Hashem kitavo, do not fear. Do not fear. And in fact, when Haman was successful in getting the king to sign a decree against the Jews, and he stopped children that were coming home from the Shushan Jewish Day School, and he asked them, what did you study today? So the first group said, we studied Al Tira, don't be afraid of the evil people. So why would the Torah say that? So obviously, because there's a reason to be afraid. There is anti-Semitism, so people are afraid. The very fact that you have to negate it means that it exists. But how do you negate it? Watch this video for a moment. It's quite powerful.
In January 1948, in the dark hours of the Soviet Union, a child was born in Stalino who was destined to symbolize mighty struggles. A bitter, global struggle between the bald eagle and the brown bear in the throes of their Cold War. A lopsided struggle between terrifying tyranny and human rights, between brutally enforced atheism and the free soul of a believer, between monstrous anti-Semitism and a proud Jew, and between the temptation to collapse and the superhuman will to survive. Nathan Sharansky graduated from Moscow's Physical Technical Institute before joining the underground human rights movement, reclaiming his Jewish heritage and emerging as a foremost dissident and spokesman for human rights. In 1973, Nathan took the calculated risk of applying for an exit visa to Israel. He was denied and rose to the forefront of Jewish refusnik activities.
Well, I was in the middle of the struggle when the situation looked very dangerous, when some of my friends in Helsinki group were already arrested, when new wave of repressions against Jewish activists was clearly prepared. And at this time I received a note from my wife Avital through some American Jewish tourists. And together with this note, a small psalm book. And Avital writes that this psalm book was with me in the last year when I was trying to help you in different places in the world. And I have a feeling that the time has come to send it to you. And I opened the book and I can't read there anything because I never learned how to read these texts. And also, most of the words I don't know. Many of the words I know, about 1,000 words, mainly of our daily struggle, prison, repressions, demonstrations, but not these words. So I decided I don't have time for these small things when I'm very busy now in organizing demonstrations and press conferences, and almost forgot.
In 1977, He was arrested on false charges of spying for the United States. But prior to the announcement of his verdict, he famously declared, "To the court I have nothing to say. To my wife and the Jewish people I say, next year in Jerusalem." Sentenced to 13 years imprisonment, he spent the next 16 months some 1,600 miles away from Jerusalem, in Moscow's Lefortovo prison, often in solitary confinement and in a special torture cell, before being transferred to a Siberian labor camp.
They bring me the list of things that they confiscated, and there is mentioned this small black book, not in Russian, and I understand that they are talking about this psalm book, which was sent to by Vital, and then I remember this note which is sent. And I demand that they'll give it to me, and it was a long struggle. 3 years after I was arrested, they returned this book to me, together with the telegram from my mother that my father passed away. And it's, of course, it's difficult when, it's always difficult, but when you cannot be with your family. And I decided that the only thing which I can do, I will be reading this psalm book until I understand. And so I'm reading these hundreds of thousands of words where I cannot understand where the sentence begins and ends, and cannot understand more than half of the words. And then simply comparing between different places of these words, I try to find out the connection between them. And it so happened that the first phrase from all these hundreds of thousands of words was a short phrase of 13 very short words, which I understood fully. That is the phrase, Gam ki elech bagay tzalamavet lo ira ra ki ata imadi. It's from the Psalm Kav Gimel, and when you'll go through the valley of shadow of death, you'll fear no evil because you are with me. And that was very powerful. It was very important for me. And each time when they were taking it from me, I was fighting and on hunger strikes, refusing to work, sometimes refusing to eat until they'll bring it to me back.
He resisted and persisted with remarkable courage. His miracle dawned in 1986, when he was released in a prisoner exchange. Leading Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Shimon Peres, welcomed him to Jerusalem.
And even when they already took me from prison and replaced all my clothes, I was lying in the snow refusing to enter the airplane without getting this book back because I felt that all my strength is there. So that was the only piece of property which I took from prison, and all these years it's always with me, and it gives me a lot of strength.
The Hebrew phrases in Sharansky's Petite Black Book were authored 28 centuries earlier by King David, who reigned from the splendid city of which Sharansky dreamed, Jerusalem. It was he who crafted the powerful line of prophetic poetry that lent indestructible hope and undefeatable strength to endless generations of Jews in distress. Even if I must tread through a valley forged by death's own shadow, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. A fountain of eternal confidence generated on behalf of each Jew in every century in the face of the mightiest and most monstrous obstacles. You are not alone. God is with you. Walk with confidence. The Creator of the universe stands guard at your side.
So let's read that piece that Sharansky was talking about. If you look at page 21, Psalm 23, just part of it. A song of David, God is my shepherd, I shall not lack. He allows me to lie in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. What are we talking about? We're talking about a time of plenty, when we're not lacking anything. I can lie down in green pastures. I live in a relative area and time, a relative era and time of freedom. Everything is still around me, and for that I'm grateful. However, even if I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. What is it all about? What is the meaning of a shepherd? David was a shepherd. A shepherd takes care of his flock. It says about David that he was able to take different age of the goats that he was shepherding or sheep that he was shepherding for the different kinds of grass. Those that had soft teeth to eat soft grass, those that had sturdy teeth to eat tougher grass. The whole idea was that the shepherd is always with them. What's the meaning of that? The meaning of this is that it's more than blind faith. It's the idea that you're never alone. I know a lot of people think about the Holocaust. There is a Chabad Jewish professor by the name of Dr. Nissan Mangel, and he lives in New York City, and his history was that he was 11 years old when he and his father and family were deported to Auschwitz.
Can you just check the waiting room? I had 2 people that bumped out somehow.
Okay. They got bumped out. We have them all. So this professor, thank you, Rabbi Cohen. This professor said that what got him through the Holocaust, because he was in the worst of situations. Of course, we know that a lot of people didn't survive. But the question was, how did he remain psychologically strong and confident in who he was? And he said there were 2 things. First of all, his father holding his hand, but also conveying a message that you're not alone, that even when one walks into the gates of hell, they're never alone. They're with God. And we'll soon see a very fascinating reading about that. The idea is that there is a certain trust that there is a destiny and things will be all right. And you're not going to fight this fight all alone. And in fact, every Saturday night, when Shabbat is out and we recite Havdalah, what is the first verse of the Havdalah? Is all about confidence. Give a look at page 22, text 7. We always say, what does it mean? Indeed, God is my deliverance. I am confident and I shall not fear, for God is my strength and my praise. He has been my salvation. On Shabbat, we live in an island and we are very safe. We're very secure. After Shabbat, we go back out into the world with the sharks. We don't know what we're going to encounter. So again, we reinforce that faith that we have in God, that we are not alone. There is something to be said about that because you see the calmness that people have. And maybe in the next lesson, we'll talk about even in the worst of times in the Holocaust, how people demonstrated. So if someone feels that the situation is hopeless, they have to understand that the full picture shows that there are a lot of blessings. You know, we have a tendency that if we look at our life, even in a day or in a week, we focus on the negative more than we focus on the positive. We take the positive for granted. The fact that we open up our eyes in the morning when we wake up, we are required to recite a blessing. Blessed are you, God, the one who opens up the eyes of the blind. There are those that cannot open up their eyes. And even if they open up their eyes, they don't see anything. The fact that we are mobile, we have movement, the fact that we can walk, the fact that we can talk, we can be productive, we can have relationships. So if you count up the majority of encounters that we have in a given day, the vast majority of it is positive. And there could be a few that are negative. And we allow the negative to really overtake our life and cause us anxiety. The concept of faith is to have a positivity bias and to focus on the good things, acknowledge the bad things, but not let the bad things overcome us. And the same thing is true with the attitude of anti-Semitism. Furthermore, when we speak about God, please turn to page 23. Never alone. This is something that's taken from the Sifri, which was part of the Midrash, it's part of the Mishnah, I mean. And it says, whenever Jews are persecuted, the godly presence is, so to speak, persecuted along with them. As it's stated in Isaiah, in all of their pain, he is pained. What does that mean? It means that we're never alone. And one of the things you ask people, I have to say that I would ask my grandfather or elder Hasidim like Reb Mendel Futas and others that they languished in these solitary prisons all alone, and they were dragged out by the vicious Russian guards to be questioned and tortured. And then they were cut off from the world. They didn't know what was going on, and they're all alone. And I said, how did you not collapse? And they looked at me like I was crazy, and they said, we were never alone. We were always with Hashem. God was with us. The Rebbe was with us. Our friends were with us. Our family was with us, because in spirit, we knew that they were with us. We never felt alone. We never felt abandoned. We never felt isolated. So the concept that we talk about faith is you're not in it alone, and we can help each other. Furthermore, if you look at text 9 on page 23, it says, those who trust in God will be surrounded by benevolence. The benevolence is the kindness that comes upon us, that we see the positive aspect in the world. So if news about the rise of anti-Semitic acts gets to us, and we begin to feel a sense of dread for our safety, then regardless of what particular effort we make to ensure our security, we have to remember what we just heard from Sharansky, that he focused on that verse in Psalm 23, I will fear no evil because you're with me. Now, having said all this, the question is, what are we supposed to do? And that's where we go with this last part of the class, which is called taking action. One of the most famous stories of anti-Semitism, in fact, many of the lessons of anti-Semitism I learned from there, is from the story of Purim. Now, I just want to recap one piece about the Purim story, and that is that we have to remember that even though it happened after the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians, by this time, most of the Jews were in Persia. And Persia at that time was a very friendly country to the Jewish people. There was no discrimination against the Jews in Persia, and Jews were able to hold high office. Proof to that is that Mordechai was in the king's cabinet, and there was no discrimination against him until Haman arose. And when Haman arose, it was the greatest shock to the Jews of that era. And the question is, how did the Jews deal with that anti-Semitism, A? And how did they deal with the threat, their existential threat that Haman had planned for the total annihilation of the Jews? So this is a very important point. We will also learn in next lesson, lesson number 2, from the Purim story, what is the source of anti-Semitism, what defines anti-Semitism, and why anti-Semitism cannot be explained away or squashed away. When we speak before about squashing the anti-Semitism, we're squashing the worry within us. We have to be confident in who we are. So here's what we're going to introduce as a whole interesting concept. And that concept is there is a partnership between God and the human being. And let me explain. When the Jews left Egypt and they were traveling through the desert in an inhospitable climate and environment, they went in with faith, because they should have asked the question, where are we going to get food from? Where are we going to get water from? Even though they took matzah with them, the matzah only survived 21 days. That's 3 weeks. Whatever the trip was going to take to the mountain, Mount Sinai, to receive the Torah, and then subsequently to travel from there to Israel, they were going to cross this terrible desert. But yet they went with faith. God gave them what they needed, as it says that the manna bread rained down from heaven, and there was the well of Miriam that accompanied them. So over there was a revealed miracle from God that God was providing for them. Yes?
What is the reason that they went with faith? They've been enslaved for 300 years, 250 years. They had nothing. They had no possessions. They worked hard, day in and day out. They were beaten. They didn't have a Torah. They had sunk to the 49th level of decadence and everything else. So where's the faith? What do they have faith in?
Good question. And in fact, the question is asked.
I mean, the whole thing is that even today,
The question.
You're not alone. You've got to have faith in God. Well, that is the bridge. That's the chasm that we're dealing with. Where's the faith? How do you get faith in God when the Nazis are all around you? You know.
So Moses. The question is, where's the faith? In short, Moses asked that question too. In fact, Moses said to God, I will come and tell them that you are going to be free. And he says, and they will not believe me, they will not have faith. And God said they have faith because it's innate and it's ingrained in them. And because you spoke evil against my children, you will be punished with leprosy. And that's why his hand became full of leprosy. And when you read the story of the crossing of the sea, what is the statement that the Torah makes? Vayaminu b'Hashem u'v'Moshe avdo, that they had total faith in God and in Moses. The faith that a Jew has is innate, but there's a separate discussion because there could be some people that have the faith on a shallow level, and there are some people that can have faith on a deeper level. Some people emerged from the Holocaust with greater faith than they had before, some did not. The point over here is that what I'm trying to make is something else. The point that we're trying to make here is not about the faith. The point that we're trying to make here is that there were periods in history when God's hand was totally revealed. You know, there's this joke that they tell, maybe it's a true story, the 6-Day War. Many of you remember the 6-Day War. What led up to the 6-Day War was fear and trepidation. Everyone was forecasting gloom and doom. They were digging graves all over Israel in the national parks. They didn't know what the end will be. And when the war came, the Israelis had this magnificent victory in 6 days. It was so magnificent that they tripled in size, and all their enemies dropped and subordinated themselves. So this journalist was. This non-Jewish journalist was interviewing one of the top Israeli generals, and he said, how did this happen? He says, there's two answers. There is the miraculous and there's the natural. So he says, give me the natural first. The natural first. God made a miracle and he saved us. So he says, what's the miraculous? The miraculous, we had an army that was able to do it. So the point of the matter is that sometimes God's hand is revealed. And the Rebbe was of the opinion, and we did a whole JLI course on that the 6-Day War was one of those moments in recent history when the miraculous was very apparent. And then there are times that the miraculous is very hidden, unless individuals see it. Purim was a time that the miraculous was hidden. It was hidden because if you look at the script of the Megillah, it looks like a very natural story. Haman rose to power. The evil queen was replaced by Esther. Esther was at the right place at the right time. She could intervene. But it's not so. Actually, it was an appearance of nature, but it was miraculous in its whole way. How do we see that? When Mordechai discovered that the decree against the Jewish people, what does it do? It says that he donned sackcloth and ashes, and he stood at the gate of the palace crying, and he assembled all the Jews, and they were crying and fasting. Esther heard about it, and she became petrified. What happened to my uncle or my cousin? And she sent a messenger, and he told her what was going on, and said, this is the occasion that you rose to power, to intercede. What was Esther's response to Mordechai when he asked her to intercede by the king? We're going to read it right now on page 25, text 10. Esther dictated a message to be sent back to Mordechai. Go and assemble all the Jews who live in Shushan. Let them fast on my behalf. Let them neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night and day. That makes sense because they needed a miracle. I and my maidens will fast likewise. In other words, they will fast for 3 days. And then I shall go to the king, although it is contrary to the law. And if I am to perish, I shall perish. Contrary to the law means that only those that were invited to see the king could come. And she said that she wasn't called to the king for 30 days. Mordecai went ahead and implemented all of what Esther had commanded him. On the 3rd day, Esther donned her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's palace. Question that is asked. When Esther is asking the people to do the religious thing and to have faith and to pray and to fast, that makes sense. But if she herself was going to use her diplomatic charm and she was going to use the attractiveness that she had, that's why the king was attracted to her in the first place, so wouldn't she deny herself the fasting? Wouldn't she at least eat and be strong and take her vitamins and drink and be healthy looking so she can glow? And yet you see that it was just the opposite. What did she do? She said she's going to fast. So if this evil king had shunned her for 30 days, why is she going to go through 3 consecutive Yom Kippur days and say, now I'm going to go to the king? Imagine on Yom Kippur, we fast for 24 hours. How do we feel by the end of the day? Some of us feel invigorated, but most of us feel dehydrated and we're ready to break the fast. Imagine if you fast 48 hours, but extend it to 3 days, and with that, she's going to go to the king. So what's the answer? The answer is a very interesting thing. That in the time when the miracle is not apparent, there is something which is called a partnership between us and God. Now let's say how it works. So when you're in the desert, the Jews have to work for their food? Absolutely not. They didn't have to pray for their food. All they had to do was go out every morning with their pails and collect the manna. And they had it. It was fresh for them to eat. They had to go to the well and draw their water, and they had what to drink. Today we have to work. Now, we know that it says in Deuteronomy that God will give a blessing in all the efforts that you put in, all the efforts of your labor. Now, how do you look at the efforts of your labor? This is very important for us to understand. We look at the efforts of the labor as if it's a partnership. We do our part and then God blesses us. That's how most people do it. You work and God gives a blessing in your work that you're able to succeed. The truth of the matter is that it's not exactly so. The truth of the matter is that everything comes from God. Even the ability that you have to work comes from God. The ability that you have to breathe comes from God. But God chose that it should be revealed through a garment. I'm going to give you an example. Take a human being. A human being is made up of body and soul. Okay? So when you're extending your arm, is it your body extending your arm or your soul extending the arm? If the soul refuses to extend the arm, can the arm be extended? No, unless you come to a doctor and he does one of these tests to see your reflex, but otherwise, no. The desire is the desire of the soul. So the soul is using the body, it's both, but the body is an extension of the soul. Now, if the soul is outside of a body, it cannot extend an arm because it doesn't have the garment, it doesn't have the body. It could extend it in a figurative way, but not in a physical way. It needs the body to be able to do it in a physical way. Why is that? Because that's how God chose to create us. God chose that the soul should dwell in the body and they should form a partnership and be harmonious. But there's no question that the dominant part of the relationship is the life, is the soul. Proof to that is when the soul decides, or the time comes that the soul leaves the body can't do anything. It's dead. It just lies there. It needs the soul to be alive. So the body really doesn't have an entity of its own. Doesn't have an independence of its own. It is totally dependent on the soul. but the soul is a garment through which the body is a garment through which the soul can reveal itself. This is a very important concept, because the same thing is true with nature. Many people say you see God when there's a miracle, but when there's nature, you don't see God. The truth of the matter is that the same God that makes the miracle is the God that makes nature, creates nature, and sustains nature. The only thing is that God desired that certain revelations should be miraculous, and certain revelations need to be through a garment. They need to look like they're through nature, but it doesn't diminish the presence of God there as well. And in a sense, that is what the miracle of Purim is. It's interesting about the miracle of Purim that if you look at the Megillah, if you look at the scroll of Esther, not once is God's name mentioned in the entire scroll, but you feel the presence of God in every aspect of what's happening. So what does this mean in regards to us? It means in regards to us that we have to use the natural means to fight against anti-Semitism. We have to use the natural means to secure ourselves. But at the same time, we have to realize that it's not nature itself that's doing it. There is a higher power, and that has to give us the security. I'm going to take it on a little bit of a philosophical level by reading a piece of Hasidic thought on page 28, text 11. This is very important for us to understand how we deal with anti-Semitism, because if you look at Esther, people think that if I only do diplomacy better, and if I do a better educational program to convince the anti-Semites that they shouldn't hate, I will succeed. It doesn't work that way. It has to work from the spiritual side and express itself in the physical side. This is what the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe, writes about life in general. He says everything that comes into being in this material world must materialize through natural means. In other words, for instance, if you want to grow food, you have to plow, you have to sow, you have to plow and sow. You have to have rain, you have to have water, and then it comes up. But it's still part of God. Nature, however, is simply a garment, meaning God's energy bringing things into existence must be dressed. In other words, they must be clothed in nature. They must be concealed and obscured to the point that an observer sees only a world that appears to run naturally. In truth, however, everything emerges directly from God himself. He obscures the divine bestowals until the miraculous and supernatural reality of material existence is not observable and material development seem perfectly natural. When, for example, God provides an individual with an ample livelihood, it is not done through a miracle as it was in the Sinai desert when God rained manna and meat from the skies. Rather, God sends the blessing through the individual's business affairs. The gains reaped through commerce appear so natural that the individual can be fooled into thinking along the lines as Moses warned before they went into Israel. It is my strength that generated the wealth, and it is my wisdom that led to my success. For I am well versed in commerce, and I know when to buy and the most prudent time to sell. This arrangement works, but truth is it comes from God. This arrangement works as long as we prepare a valid garment through which the divine flow of sustenance can descend into a material reality. Our occupation must be proportionate, so that according to the rules of nature, the sum required for our livelihood could be theoretically be gained via such an occupation. If this requirement is met, our occupation serves as a perfect garment in which God can disguise his blessing. For we can easily claim, I acquired this wealth through my own skills, because it is indeed considered natural for such an occupation to yield that range of profits, and such an assertion is logically sound, and our occupation is an appropriate conduit for God's kindness. Accordingly, while we work, we should be mindful of our belief that our earnings are God's blessing. They are like any other open miracle, like the miracle of the manna. Our actions merely weave a garment behind which God can disguise his blessing. One should apply the same concept to all other areas of life. Pursue your needs in accordance with your understanding, with the intention of forging an appropriate garment through which God will send his blessings. God will then act as he sees fit, providing the truest form of good that is appropriate for you. So there's this interplay between the divine and us. So how does this relate to anti-Semitism? It relates to anti-Semitism that whatever happens in anti-Semitism is not a natural event. As we're going to learn in lesson 2, anti-Semitism is not a natural hatred. It's not a hatred that comes because of logic or because of reason, as we're going to see in lesson 2, that the Jews are accused of everything, being on the right, being on the left, being capitalist, being communist, being this, being that. Anti-Semitism doesn't need a reason, but it does actually express itself in nature. So therefore, we have to recognize that our combat of anti-Semitism, even though it's done in a natural way, but it has to have the God aspect in it. It has to have the supernatural that encloses itself in the natural. So for instance, if security experts come to us and say, we need to have security guards standing outside your building in order to provide the security. So it makes practical sense, it's true. But we know as well that that in itself becomes the conduit for God's blessing that we should be protected. In other words, you cannot separate the two. And as the Rebbe writes in text 12 on page 32, Esther's conduct demonstrated that she considered her act of approaching Ahasuerus as a mere garment for God's salvation, knowing that it would in fact be an entirely supernatural miracle. It was therefore necessary that the Jews first pray and fast to become worthy of such a miracle. What does this mean? It's not that if you try the natural way and you don't succeed, so then you rely on prayer. It is so bad that I have to pray. What Esther is teaching is just the opposite, that even the natural way needs the prayers, because the prayers comes through the natural way. It's the same thing as when you go to a physician to be healed. If someone is sick, so they pray before they go to the physician. The physician also prays, even though they're going to do a natural examination and they will give you natural therapies and they will give you medicines, but they will all know that it has to have the blessing of God in order to do it. It's not that you say, okay, if the medical practitioner or provider failed, then I go to God and I pray to God. It doesn't work that way. So he says, nevertheless, because God desired that the supernatural salvation should appear to be within the natural order, Mordechai instructed Esther to make an appeal to Ahasuerus despite the grave risk. Consequently, it was not of great significance for the features of the garment to meet all the demands of the natural order, for the primary concern was not the medium through which God's salvation would arrive, but rather the need to ensure that the cause for salvation has been secured. Let's take it back to the 6-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, all the other wars. So when we say that you have to have faith in the face of anti-Semitism, it doesn't mean that you sit back and say, I'm not going to do anything because God is going to protect me. That happened at the time when the Israelites left Egypt, when God said, I will fight the war, don't even pray to me. But that's not the way God does it today. It was never the intent that that's the way it should be. The intent was that we have to be proactive. We have to do everything we can diplomatically. We have to do everything that we can educationally. We have to do everything we can in a proactive way to secure our premises. But on the other hand, we don't do it out of fear of panic. We do it with a sense of confidence because we have the faith. So it goes together. So when you talk about the defense, and unfortunately you need it. I remember as a child after the 6-Day War, because I was in 7th grade at the time, we had a play and there was one young man dressed as an Israeli soldier. And in one hand, he held the Torah, and in the other hand, he held an Uzi. And he said, with this and with this, I protect myself. What is the meaning with this and with this, I protect myself? You need both in order, not because God can't do it, it's because that's what God desired. God desired that we should do things through the natural way. So what do we learn when we go to this first case of anti-Semitism, which this sets the course? It sets the course to say the following. Anti-Semitism is a reality. It's not as prevalent as we think it is, but we still have to keep our guard up. But at the same time, we need to know that we're not alone and we have to have faith in God. And the faith in God is that God will help us, but we still have to do what we need to do in the natural way in order to protect ourselves. This is a very important attitude when it comes to the idea of Judaism and when it comes to the idea of our protection. And this is what we called a miraculous partnership. Now, I know many of you are here to try to understand the theology of anti-Semitism. So I'll give you a little brief, and then there's another reading that I want to do for tonight's class. The reality is that anti-Semitism can disguise itself as a natural phenomena, but as I said before, it's not a natural phenomenon. I mentioned early on that the Talmud says that at the time that God descended on Mount Sinai and gave the Torah to the children of Israel, at the same time, hatred for the Jews descended on earth. Doesn't mean that all non-Jews hate Jews. There are a lot of non-Jews that love Jews. They're called philo-Semites. There are a lot of non-Jews that don't necessarily love Jews, but they don't hate Jews either. They're neutral. But then there are a lot of non-Jews that hate Jews, and there's no reason for it. They themselves don't know what the reason is, because any reason that they give is just the opposite of what another anti-Semite will say. Why anti-Semitism is there, we will discuss in the lesson number 4. How anti-Semitism manifests itself, we'll discuss in lesson number 2. But one thing that we need to know is that it will never be totally eliminated until Mashiach comes. It's impossible that it should be eliminated. It can be diminished. We have to speak out against it. But on the other hand, we cannot live in fear. There was once a group, this was in 1972, a group of young and upcoming Jewish leaders that came to meet with the Rebbe. And the Rebbe told them then in 1972 that anti-Semitism is rising and it's spreading like wildfire, especially on college campuses. This is in 1972. The Rebbe was way ahead of his time. And he said, you will ask me how to fight it, and I will tell you that there is only one way to fight it, and that's through Jewish pride. The notion that you hear in some countries that leaders of the country say that Jews should hide their visible Jewish signs is actually feeding the anti-Semites, and it's a defeat of Judaism. And that is very, very, very wrong. On the contrary, when I would hear that there's a place where there's anti-Semites, if I'm walking with a hat and they can't see my kippah, I will deliberately take off my hat and show them that I have the kippah and I'm not afraid of them. As I said in the beginning of the class, I have experienced anti-Semitism here and abroad. One time was in France in 1974. I was at the train station Gare de Lyon. I was buying a train ticket to go back to my yeshiva in Brunois, and I was surrounded by 3 people who looked like they were ready to take me on, to beat me up for no reason. And I was very, very calm. I don't know why I was calm. And I was holding a case. I put down my case and I rolled up my sleeves and I said, I'm from Brooklyn. I'm not afraid of you. I'm a proud Jew. And they walked away. They didn't touch me. I don't know if it was the Brooklyn part or the Jewish part, but I don't know what it was. But what I did know was that if I stood there firmly with pride and no fear, they just left. They didn't do anything. And they looked very menacing and threatening in the beginning. I'm not going to say that it always works, but what I'm trying to say is that the first thing that we have to take with anti-Semitism is not to shrivel up. And the second thing is what we learned before from Deborah Lipstadt. Don't let anti-Semitism define us. In other words, for those people that make anti-Semitism or Holocaust education the main part of their Judaism, they're missing the boat. Unfortunately, what happens with kids, that their only exposure to Judaism is anti-Semitism. So if you're lucky enough that they fight it, is fine. Otherwise, they say, what do I need to be part of this group that is so hated and despised? Why do I need to be part of this area that they hate me? Let me not be like that. And the opposite is true. Judaism is so rich theologically, historically, traditionally, ritually. There's so much beauty to it. And if you look also at the history of Judaism, some of the greatest Jewish works and literature was created in the time of the worst oppression. They never allowed the anti-Semites to define them or stop them. Finally, I want to finish with a story that happened in 1990. Sometimes there is still miracles. This was one of those times that we saw that there was a miracle. I actually either can read or play you the video. If I can get it, I'll play the video. Otherwise, I will tell you the story. Let's see if this works. Tell me if you can hear it.
An excerpt from the Jewish educational media film, Faithful and Fortified, Volume 3, Israel's Government Leaders. Rabbi Benjamin Klein is a member of the Rebbe's Secretariat.
Also, da was hier, die Song kommt, also geht, der Ascher geht Bedingungen, man sagt Platz, nicht mehr Platz. Aber wichtigen Platz, können Sie mal in der Welt, in der Sache hat in der Welt. Aber ich gewohnt habe, da habe ich mir gehört, und dann sage ich mir, ich habe doch nicht mehr anders, nicht nur anders. Ich habe gemeint, ja, da wird es. Sie kommen bei mir, כן natürlich wissen, כן ich werde noch wissen, das heißt, wenn ich da keinen darf ist. Nachher einen kommt zu mir, Rebbe, ich weiß da mal drauf, und Rebbe, habe ich wieder noch nachher, kommen wir mit mir.
Sollte kommen eine Idee, schon paar Mincha mehr, als Osho, Paton, Ogide, Marilor, zu der Machloki sein, der Bechol Model Shuhu, als Royal Messias, wo der Schöpfer mit Zähne Israel und Schöpfer sich übersehen der Schöpfer sich hat das Verdienst verbunden mit dem Gut, Bechule, Wilde Hand, Bedauer am Kursa und es lag noch auf tief, Tachper, bemühe der Verstandig, aber gab nicht sein, Israel, in Kirche, mit Per, weil er geht zu Kolumnen verbunden mit Per, ohne Ding. Und immer da Isop, und immer da Teil, was man durchgeht, und der Verstand, dass Ekel mit Kohle, Kolumnen bitte zu ihm, der andere aber mit einer Happe, Abdul und Zukunft, schließen wir hin, mit einer Schäfer, und schließen nach Hochma, mit einer Sichlos.
Ja, dann ist es zu gucken, in der Kutte. Das ist auch keine Sache, ich habe auch gesagt, wie, zwei Schätzchen, kommen. Ja, aber Leben gewinnt. Так и говорит. New York Times nicht mehr von der Welt. New York Times ist in Berlin News, aber man soll die News geben, das soll gewählen News. Das ist gewähnt, das sagt. Also in New York Times ist dann nach morgen, als mit Gewalt bombardieren, weiß das geworden ist. Aber nicht der Rebbe, nicht der.
Der Fall ist wirklich massiv. Und die Bauer Chabad ist nicht mehr in Jahren und Teile ist. Aber viele, wenn das verbunden ist mit der Woche, mit der Mini-Bechur, weil Balken das mit zu bis Doku-Pfleg und viele das richtig kommen und trachten gut, wird sein gut. Aber du soll nicht niedriger werden, als verschoben. In Kamus als Doku, ich nicht in Nechus als Doku. nicht mäßig sein, die Besucher, die Kirche, aber so wollen die Schule, der Wert von Gimel, Studis, nicht, wenn man geht, sagt, Kopfmann, so ein Gimel, nicht mehr Dinge, von dem sie will, es ist Leute. Und Martin in Gruppe Kirche sein oder mäßig sein, die müssen wir herachten bei Asien, was verwendet sich und was sie vergessen. Man Kirche schon mit Hallo, Jütke, Hallo, Luki. Weil der sehr, kol Chad v'Chad, wird sich Bescheid sein, was noch kommt dann in der Richtung und in dem Ruach, und danach es kam dass es der Kinder in sich hat Meli sein, anders in Noschen Vitava, sie finden das bis wie Bosse. Der Kopf nicht Mapri sein, und bejachet im See, sehen, dass sie so Messi sein, mit Tieren, mit Sesser, mit Techalchor, und mit ihrem Bitochen Amiti.
Order the film today at gemstore.com.
So the point of this video is not to panic, but to do practical things. And here you find that the Prime Minister of Israel himself, Shamir, had his chief of staff, Eliakim Rubinstein, who was very close to the Rebbe and to Rabbi Klein, call the Rebbe and ask the Rebbe for a blessing. And the Rebbe gave the blessing, but then he says you have to do something practical, which is extra Torah study, extra charity, reading of Psalms, and having a positive attitude. And in this case, it was foiled. And what Rabbi Klein was saying is the press, when they were reporting, didn't say why, but to Chabad, we knew why. The point of the matter is that we combine the two, the spiritual deeds and aspect, the faith in God, but at the same time, we take the natural means. And with that, we could succeed. So I appreciate you being here for the first class. That sets the tone. The second tone, we're actually going to go in and look at the philosophy of anti-Semitism. I'll just give you one tip and hint. The Talmud speaks about Achashverosh and Haman, that one had a pit and one had a mound. And they thought that by taking the mound and filling the pit, they'll make themselves whole. And that explains the true essence of anti-Semitism. When you understand the true essence of anti-Semitism, then you know how to fight anti-Semitism and how to deal with it. So stay tuned for next week. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure having you, and let's hope that we don't have to deal with these kind of issues ever again.
Okay, so I'd like to discuss in this class about